seems to act like a living organic being, a monstrous colloidal consciousness, exceeding all terrestrial creative capacity. To the scientists in the novel, it was a protoplasmic ocean brain enveloping the entire planet and idling its time away in extravagant theoretical cognition about the nature of the universe. Earthly mathematicians were willing to consider the inherent creativity of such a creature, while others saw such idle, extravagant cogitation as threatening. Some referred to the planet Solaris as a metamorph and yogi ocean because of its transformational qualities and the capacity of its undulating surface to generate extremely diverse abstract forms never before seen on Earth, while others who were frustrated by such enigmatic creativity referred to it as autistic ocean. This fantastic image of a cogitating planet, befuddling scientists with its generative capacity, and yet somehow recognizable as a mathematical being in its rendering of unusual structures, offers a fruitful, starting image of the strange mix of creative and formal activity that constitutes mathematics. Like the vapors rising up from Solaris, the foggy illusions of mathematics are multiple. Illusions of transcendence, universality, and eternity. Taking an ecological approach instead allows us to study mathematical habits as embodied, situated, cultural, planetary, and more than human. The point here is to think broadly about mathematical activity and appreciate the alien or non-human qualities of mathematical reasoning and invention. The speculative power of mathematics, whereby abstractions are engendered, is not only a cultural act of constructing symbolic form, but also accentuates and affirms thought's capacity to become radically alien to itself. I introduce this chapter with this theme not to mystify mathematics, but to better understand human mathematics as part of larger eco-cognitive processes and to direct our attention to the speculative work of the imagination in mathematical reasoning. As Badiou suggests, mathematical thought is the exercise of an alteration, of an estrangement of the intelligence. In order to do mathematics, one must leverage mathematics as an alteration on thought, as a means for thinking otherwise. Badiou turns to Isidore Ducasse, known as the Count of Le Tremont, who suggests that the alien qualities of mathematics achieve a denaturing of man, a transmigration of his essence, a positive becoming monster. In this chapter, I consider various case studies of mathematical creativity and invention, for how these involve precisely concepts to tremble with indeterminacy, as Cantor did with the concept of dimension. And yet, surprise is a deeply relational event, emergent through the interaction of different bodies. Surprises are eventful moments or happenings. As events, surprises are not owned by the subject that undergoes them. Events redistribute the sensible across the realm of the plausible. A surprise is an event through which two or more bodies interpenetrate in new ways. A new assemblage emerges. Ideas mix and intermingle during surprises in ways that bring forth imminent tensions and new surface effects. New ways of sharing new kinds of sense, nonsense, ultimately destabilizing past consensus. What matters in a deep learning neural net is how value is correlated with weight, and how these weights are distributed and revised across the network. The hypothesis space is indeed the multidimensional array of possible weighted significance assigned to each element of input data. The algorithm modifies weights so as to reduce overall error, thereby inducing an error function which emerges from the process. We can better understand the nature of computational habits when we understand how the power to imagine is situated in these kinds of techniques of the false. The material labor of imagining otherwise. Abduction operates in computation as a cognitive corrective effort to make sense of the anomalous indicted facts by assessing future possible outcomes that follow from certain hypotheses. Deep neural nets are demanding and meandering learners. The method of gradient descent seeks to minimize this divergent thinking, to shepherd the algorithm over the undulating terrain of uncertainty, away from those propositions that are far-fetched and those that are deceptively truth-like, until it can settle on a reasonable hypothesis. As Parisi warns, big data methods underscore the links between effect and reason, whereby a chain of contingencies becomes the driving force for decision-making actions. I suggest here that this process is best understood as deeply rooted in the vast granulated power of the false, a false that is differentially spread across the baroque folds of plausibility. Generative adversarial networks have a dueling structure of a generator-discriminator built into them, where the generator acts like the imagination extending and creating fictions, and the discriminator guesses whether the work is fiction or not, and the degree of trust in such decisions. The first guesses of what might be considered a plausible choice are absurd and far from the training data, generated as they are from a random flux of pixels. Scans are most often used on arrays of pixels, selected without conceptual guidance. This noisy generator proffering useless hypotheses plucked from the vast hypothesis space is precisely what is needed for the machine learning to be robust. Gradually, the generator learns from the process of judgment and generates hypothetical propositions that are more accurate and capable of fooling the discriminator, who has also learned during this process. Rather than a sloppy mess of pixel arrays, a Jackson Pollock painting, might we train our deep neural nets on data that is more structured? This debate is directly related to questions about the explainability of AI algorithms and the broader question of what constitutes a good explanation in mathematics. Abduction is not only a human faculty, but an expression of worldly activity, an ongoing onto epistemic process. Through abduction, an eco-cognitive creative impulse bends the breaks in relational structures, remixing matter and meaning, allowing for circulating flows of anticipation and surprise, so that a genuinely new mathematics might emerge. Accordingly, just as we say that a body is in motion and not that motion is in a body, we ought to say that we are in thought and not that thoughts are in us. P.S. What was that? One of the snakes had seized hold of its own tail. The form whirled mockingly before my eyes. As if by a flash of lightning I awoke, and this time also I spent the rest of the night working out the consequences of the hypothesis. Kekule. In his dream, Kekule contemplated before his mind's eye a diagram, a sign which embodied a possible structure that, if true, would explain the relationship among the parts of the object under his scrutiny, the binding structure of hydrogens and carbons in a molecule of benzene. By a sudden insight, Kekule had put together pieces of jigsaw, observing through his mental eye atoms moving in a specific way which formed a structure that he had never been able to discern before. Kekule's flash of insight was not a simple dream, it was a generation of an abductive hypothesis. The imaginative character of diagrammatic reasoning was possible because the iconic part of the diagram represents other information not explicitly contained in that signification. If creativity is jeopardized, and in particular scientific abductive creativity, it is practically impossible to acceptably and successfully deal with our technological societies. At the center of this perspective on cognition, and consequently of abduction, is the emphasis on the practical agent, on the individual agent operating on the ground, that is, in the circumstances of real life, in all its contexts, from the most abstractly logical and mathematical to the most roughly empirical. It is always important to emphasize the cognitive nature of abduction. The price of uberty, a potentiality to arrive at undiscovered truths, is lost security. It's more appropriate to adopt the more general concepts of input and output instead of premises and conclusions. In such a way, it is more natural to accept the multimodal character of the inferences involved. In this framework, we expect to have a logic in which the artificial language presents an extendable, expressive capacity, and that can also be itself composed of icons and not only of symbols like it is occurring in the case of heterogeneous logics. Affordances refer to the idea of agent-environment mutuality. René Thom nicely says that nature is present in the behavior of inanimate beings, but the animate being is able to exploit natural regularities in order to stabilize connections that would be accidental, not generic, in the inanimate world. May the studies of visual systems continue to grow, since this ought to be the logic of the future. The verbal mode is characterized by linear, sequential, reductionist, and abstract thinking. All the medium of images demands a holistic, simultaneous, synthetic, and concrete mode of perception, thus problematizing the role of linguistic signs as the basic means of communication. The unanalyzable, the inexplicable, the unintellectual runs in a continuous stream through our lives. It is the sum total of consciousness, whose meditation, which is the continuity of it, is brought about by a real effective force behind the consciousness. Recent research on mind in motion inadvertently confirms the Peircean assertion of moving pictures of thought as inferences, and full-fledged semiotic reason incorporates the ingenious Peircean category of abduction. For Peirce, abduction is equivalent to those operations of the mind which are logically exactly analogous to inferences, excepting only that they are unconscious and therefore uncontrollable and therefore not subject to criticism. While partaking of the initial gut feeling is the bodily response to a surprising fact, abduction punctuates conscious rule-based propositional thinking. Still, it is a mode of reasoning, yet one that comes to us like a flash. It is an act of insight. The significance of the unconscious defies any reduction of learning to a solely conscious mental process. It is chiefly body-mind learning, where the material and mental and the unconscious consciousness form a genuine bipolar Janus-faced sign. Describing the structure of abduction, Pierce noted that the first premise is not actually thought, it is in the mind habitually. This of itself would not make the inference unconscious, but it is so because it is not recognized as an inference. The conclusion is accepted without our knowing how, as though intuitively and in the manner of instinctive reason. Specifically what Magnani calls model-based creative abduction that strongly relates to visual signs. While being vague, ambiguous, and processed subconsciously, such image-based hypothesis formation can be considered as a form of visual or iconic abduction. This chapter uses a specific image from the deck of tarot pictures that, while traditionally located at the low end of popular culture, are a perfect subject for research in semiotics. While it is true that medical semiology is purely a study of the natural indices of pathology, psychosomatics, by contrast, sees in such symptoms reactions which are destined to communicate information, desires which a subject is not able to express any other way. Psychology, too, postulates the notion of subliminal messages which are not conscious. Signification is more or less codified. Here, too, we have the frontier between logics and poetics. Pierce, addressing certain telepathic phenomena, stressed that such faint sensations ought to be fully studied by the psychologist, assiduously cultivated by every man. Functioning in the capacity of the topology of plots, a reading of the spatial distribution of pictures pointed to the existence of certain narrative units and motif functions, together with formalization in terms of the ordering of information. A notion of the dynamic relativism in human communication placed tarot readings in a framework of autopoiesis, making the very act of perception itself as an individualized autopoietic process. In the framework of Pierce's semiotics, a distribution of tarot pictures in a layout prizes diagrams that, in a mode analogous to his existential graphs, render literally visible before one's eyes the operation of thinking in actu. The fool as a figure of abduction. All logical relations can be studied by being displayed in the form of existential graphs or iconic representations. Such diagrammatic thinking likely yielding solutions to otherwise unsolvable logical problems, while the meaning created by this diagrammatic method is altogether something virtual and lies not in what is actually thought, but in what is thought may be connected within representation. A series of representations ultimately culminate in actual effects as practical bearings, as per Pierce's pragmatic maxim. Pierce considered consciousness a vague term and asserted that if it is to mean thought, it is more without us than within. This outside of cognition is the dimension of the unconscious. Interpreting and bringing to consciousness the silent voice of images is what gives them meaning and significance. If the images, like certain sorts of ink spots, have certain effects on the conduct, mental and bodily, of the interpreter, then habit change and belief revision may follow. Abduction jumpstarts the process of learning as a subtle feeling comparable with a particular musical emotion. This emotion is essentially the same thing as a hypothetic inference. The nothingness is expressed by the numeral 0, an ambiguous sign of ultimate wisdom or total folly, a number that historically and perhaps not entirely arbitrarily has been assigned to the very first picture, called the Fool in the tarot set. It is when the surprising fact is observed that the fool's inquiring mind begins apprehending experience by means of abduction, the peculiar logic of discovery rather than the logic of justification. If a priori existing concepts as clear and distinct as Cartesian ideas were readily available to know the meaning of any novel experience, it would not come as such a surprise with almost uncanny impact. 0 can be described as the germinal nothing, boundless possibility, boundless freedom. The sense of freedom available for the fool in his non-metric semiotic space opens the possibility of a semiotic relation. He is literally me.
The environment, the natural world behind the cliff in the picture and the fool, symbiotically has a mind of its own, which would be qualified by Peirce as the quasi-mind, wherein all the regularities of nature and of mind are regarded as products of growth and evolution. The world of signs and actions, semiosis, demonstrates the emergence of another kind of causation, which would not be possible without the aspect of free play. A throw of dice symbolized by the fools teetering at the cliff. Signs located outside of the human mind are embodied laws constituting matter which, according to Peirce, is also a state of mind, a frozen habit that as such subscribes to regularity or routine, quasi-mind. Nonetheless, it is the idea of continuity or the passage from one form to another by insensible degrees that ensures the overall sign process ties to consciousness, thus ultimately fulfilling the condition of genuine intentionality or aboutness. Mental content is always already about something, even if this something is imperceptible, hiding in the unconscious, and cannot as yet be properly recognized or articulated. The paradox of the unconscious abductive inference is in full force. From a semiotic perspective, any thinker always engages in a dialogue with that thinker's unknown future self, because his thoughts are what he is saying to himself, that is saying to that other self that is just coming into life in the flow of time. Your self of one instant appeals to your deeper self for his ascent. The term retroduction as a process of discovery is interchangeable with abduction, as it stresses the backward movement necessary for intuitive learning from within, while also performing a leap forward into the unknown. Contemporary neuroscience and neurophilosophy recognize the existence of an imperceptible temporal gap in brain activity, during which a kind of unconscious processing of information is supposed to take place. This dynamics determines the entire readiness for action in the next moment, just like that exhibited by the fool icon. Neither deduction nor induction contributes a single new concept to the structure of knowledge. In the process of diagrammatic reasoning, the heuristics that there might lie further information hidden in the multi-perspective structure of the picture is always present. In the Laws of Form, G. Spencer Brown demonstrated that logic can be arithmeticized. He, in fact, added the unmarked state to Peirce's existential graphs and allowed the use of empty space in place of complex of signs. This makes a profound difference and reveals a beautiful and simple calculus of indications underlying the existential graphs. Spencer Brown's true contribution is that he added nothing to the Peirce theory, the nothingness being the sign of the fool. Thus, it becomes possible to construct logic by using the fundamental first step of drawing a distinction, abductively or intuitively, and proceeding with two acts of making a mark to signify distinction and subsequently repeating the mark. This is the fool's prerogative in the play of semiosis, to make a difference. He doesn't know the range of experiences that will have been encountered, even as what enters the mind as information always depends on a selection, and this selection is mostly unconscious. In this sense, one should not speak about getting information, rather information is something we create. In between the Platonic worlds of the intelligible and sensible is reminiscent of the theory of recollection, exemplified in Meno, when it is by contemplating geometrical figures as visual signs and engaging in a dialogue, and that is, actively participating in the semiotic image-word relationship that the slave boy begins to learn. Constructing the figures Socrates, the dialectic leads the young slave to discover by himself the geometrical truths he already possesses in his spirit. The imaginal world of archetypes, in contrast to being purely imaginary or simply unreal, constitutes a distinct order of reality corresponding to a distinct mode of perception. Archetypal ideas permeating the mundus imaginalis and inhabiting the unconscious manifest in life as habits, of which, in the absence of learning and critical self-reflection, individuals remain largely unaware, behaving repetitively in the grip of old assumptions and beliefs, thus reinforcing habitual patterns that sink even deeper into the unconscious. The activity of Kantian schematism is implicit too, resulting from imagination and completely unknowable as regards its way of working, empty and devoid of any possibility of being rationally analyzed. It is an activity of tacit knowledge. Indwelling refers to the tacit or proximal dimension of experience at the very interface of human bodies with the natural world, that is, at the subconscious level. New discovery dwells in bodily knowing and can break through the boundaries of old knowledge, thus creating new mental content which has previously been only implicit. It is gained by realizing the diagrammatical character of picture viewing is not least the close relation between picture and thought. It is a corollary to Peirce's generalized conception of logic that thought, even if general, never leave an intuitive iconic basis, and the diagram as a category is Peirce's heir to Kant's famous schemata as a meeting place between intuition and thought. Polanyi affirms the logical character of reasoning from clues, signs, which is not deductive, proceeds in the mode of tacit or implicit inference. Direct deduction gives way to indirect mediated integration. Access to knowledge then, and this is the crucial point, is available within ourselves as much as without, making a semiotic transcendental relative, immanent in Polanyi's tacit dimension. Human awareness has a vectorial or directional character in the sense that the dynamics between the two poles, subsidiary and focal, proceeds along a single continuum. Importantly, knowledge and acting coalesce, and the dimension of awareness is coupled with the activity dimension. The action of signs proceeds between the focal and subsidiary poles, as well as between the conceptual and the bodily, that is, between the unconscious and the consciousness, when the tacit or implicit mode of knowing becomes explicit. An integrative act takes place when the particulars of subsidiary awareness coalesce into a meaningful whole. Meaning lurks perpetually in the future. In the fool's paradoxical but semiotically real world, where that which exists as potentiality can turn into actuality only in some indeterminate future. The future per se is not totally indeterminate, but subsists as future anterior. Future that will have been means that it retroductively culminates in has been, which makes it always already projectable. The so-called triangle argument in physics supports this assertion. The coexistence of past, present, and future aspects of time in the layout, the infamous fortune-telling, is possible because they appear momentarily frozen in their locations in space and time. The static layout of images is a frozen slice of the dynamic process of semiosis. Embodying a self-reflective triadic structure, the layout demonstrates the paradoxical memory of the future. Indeed, a man denotes whatever is the object of his attention at the moment. He connotes whatever he knows or feels of this object, and is the incarnation of this form. His interpretant is the future memory of this cognition, his future self. A leap into the unknown, yet in no way unknowable, always has an aesthetic aspect, as intellectual beauty or an elegant, albeit fallible solution. Knowledge in semiotics is always already fallible, and concepts are never completely determined. They are born from potentially insightful intuitions, abductive leaps, guesses, and hunches. Emphasizing the role of diagrammatic reasoning, stress that passing from one diagram to the other, the inquirer will be supposed to see something that is of a general nature, thus contributing to making the ideas clear. The purpose of a diagrammatic mode was to depict thought's very movement, processual character in terms of interconnecting lines, schemes, figures, abstract mappings. In fact, Peirce believed that all thought is sign process, and hence it is capable of being presented diagrammatically. Referring to diagrams, Peirce explains that they lead to the synthesis of consciousness, hence accomplished learning, by awakening intuitions based on the demonstrable relations between elements, which before seemed to have no necessary connection. Intuition is the regarding of the abstract in a concrete form by the realistic hypostatization of relations that is the one sole method of valuable thought. Still, how can abduction or intuition be represented if the subtle knowledge in its tacit mode escapes its precise representation in propositional thought or verbal language but lurks in the signs of the unconscious? It is the genius of the mind that takes up all these hints of sense, adds immensely to them, and makes them precise, and shows them in intelligible form in the intuitions of space and time. Descartes considered imaginary numbers to be absurd or fictitious. It was he who first coined the term. There was no place for them in Newton's mechanistic philosophy either. Leibniz recorded their intermediary character and qualified them as the ontological amphibium, positioned at the level of the divine intellect between being and non-being. They indeed symbolize divination in the form of insight into the as yet unknown. To Gauss, however, the meaning of imaginary numbers was derived from the geometrical, hence diagrammatical or graphical, representation. What is growth? Not mere increase. Peirce paraphrases Shakespeare when positioning that the ontological status of abduction partakes of airy nothings to which the mind of a poet, pure mathematician, or another might give local habitation and a name within that mind. These airy nothings, the fool's domain, exist at a level of complexity exceeding the realm of real numbers. They do not belong to available sense data. A vectorial diagram represents the dynamics inherent in the structure of signs. It is constructed on the basis of projective geometry, employing a perspectival composition which uses the technique of parallel projectors emanating from an imaginary object and intersecting a plane of projection at right angles, coplanar, to create images. Peirce inquired whether geometry rests upon any observations concerning clairvoyance, and argued for the application of geometry to the logic of relatives. Projective geometry is no more about definite objects or figures and their respective properties, but deals with relational structures and their possible transformations. According to the innovative area of so-called virtual logic, it's remarkable that domains imaginary with respect to arithmetic are vitally real with respect to geometry. It was Bernard Riemann who merged projective geometry with the idea of complex numbers. On the Riemann sphere, 0 and infinity are but two opposite poles. In semiotic discourse, they would therefore represent a perfect sign. In quantum mechanics, 0 marked by the fool as vacuum is a source of infinite energy. Context of semiotics, René Thom presents a case of projected shadow as an example of structural isomorphism produced by coupling, in other words, a semiotic encounter of two poles. It is light illuminating the original and casting the shadow as its image that performs the function of interaction. The formation of images is a manifestation of the universal dynamics that allows the appearance of forms charged with more meaning. Abduction creates depth in the understanding that amounts to a sign's ultimate intelligibility because of non-local contact with some sort of platonic world. What inhabits the platonic world is not only the true, but also the good and the beautiful as non-computable elements. For example, judgment, common sense, insight, aesthetic sensibility, compassion, morality. Unconscious ideas express themselves non-verbally at the level of feelings, abductions, and instinctive actions, bypassing the representation in consciousness, and hence cannot be articulated or deliberated upon in propositional language. Plato's famous division, first presented as the line in Republic 4, was an indication of his envisioning the multiplicity of levels of knowledge, and enables the realization that sensible things are particular reflections, projections of universals, or Peirce's generals, residing in the intelligible realm and available to cognition through the existence of the imaginal world, the included third secret thing. Sign to actualize its potency must be compelled by its object. Feature of double codification, analog and digital, in reading and interpreting visual signs that are spread, seemingly randomly, in a given tarot layout, relates to a specific problem in contemporary physics, namely the emergence of the discrete. distinct from the continuous. Physicist Henry Stapp posits the hypothetical mechanism of a spontaneous quantum reduction event associated with a certain mathematical projection operator, the action of which seems to be direct via projection, but that also causes indirect changes, producing faster-than-light effects. These effects indeed manifest themselves in the edusemiotics of tarot images, not unlike Einstein's proverbial spooky actions at a distance. The fool's abduction initiates the evolution of thought signs, even if in the beginning, infinitely remote, there was a chaos of unpersonalized feeling, rendering the poor fool overwhelmed and immobile indeed. What must be the characters of all signs used by a scientific intelligence, that is, an intelligence capable of learning by experience? Human beings do have an inherent capacity for learning, a tendency towards revising beliefs and creating new habits. However, the historical emphasis on verbal language and propositional thought took away the ability to reason intuitively or abductively. Thankfully, the personal computer has greatly increased the impact of the iconic revolution and continues to do so. Schlein. Visual abduction catches new knowledge because information emerges as a result of the inherently nonlinear, functionally self-organizing dynamics, constituting the process of semiosis as the actions of signs, which in turn are complementary pairs or opposing tendencies that must coexist to make possible the creation of functional information. It's conceived of lingua characteristica as a universal pictographic or ideographic alphabet of human thought, complemented by calculus and reflecting the ratio embedded in nature, with a formal scientia generalis of all possible relations between all concepts in all branches of knowledge taken together. Unified science of all sciences, called Mathesis Universalis, would create a formal universal language in which Leibniz included pictures and various graphic geometrical figures as a possible medium of communication. Yet, the contemporary transference of Leibniz's dream into research in artificial intelligence does not seem to bring current science any closer to realizing his project. As Penrose insisted, it seems that whatever brain activity is responsible for consciousness, it must depend upon a physics that lies beyond computational simulation. Leibniz's project refers to the injunction of knowledge representation. Philosophy presents language as a system of representations a priori distinguished from signs. The representational system presupposes a class of things represented which are not representations themselves, hence outside language and outside thought. Linguistic sign and other regimes of signs are typically ignored, is supposed to represent transparently or literally. On account of this, a poetic, artistic, or nonverbal regime of signs is a type of language that represents indirectly via mediation, cannot be objective in describing reality. Semiotic reality may have its own language of expression, even if its discourse appears silent, seen but not heard. Examining the triadic structure of signs leads to understanding that the level of potential meanings for a given sign must exceed the steady references already present in any conscious mind, because semiotic intelligence encompasses thinking, mental world, as coupled or integrated with doing, physical world. The science of signs demonstrates harmony or analogy between ethical reason and experimental logic. An expanded consciousness in which the unconscious has been integrated can transcend the limitations of the present and let in various opportunities afforded by an open future. When complemented by visual signs in addition to linguistic ones, edusemiotics, by realizing the virtual meanings in practice, can paradoxically compute the essentially non-computable. Such computation, to a degree of course, is unlikely to become a strict rule-based algorithm and needs clarification. At the cutting edge of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, computers are understood as dynamical systems that indeed manipulate bits. These units of information are not strictly reducible to what physics calls particles. They are moments in the overall process which is represented significantly by analog and not solely digital information. Seth Lloyd posits a computational universe full of invisible information of which agents would typically be unconscious. That as such computes its own evolution in a self-organizing manner, not unlike the process of semiosis. This follows the motto, it from bit, or better said, it from qubit, which means that the observable universe arises out of invisible information. Energy is needed to process this invisible information and make it relatively visible at the level of material reality observable by our regular senses. Matter, energy, and information are connected in an interrelation that parallels the structure of Peirce's genuine science. It cannot be otherwise in a world perfused with science, where matter and mind presuppose each other, thus forming a complementary pair, a body-mind indeed. For Peirce, matter is effete mind. It is endowed with proto-mentality. It is potentiality made actual, which is exercised by the fool in the form of abductive inference. Quantum entanglement is somewhere between objects being separate and being in communication with each other. There's an analog to this in semiotics and edusemiotics. If a thinker literally steps out of the framework of the Cartesian mind, separated from the world, and connects in practice with the embodied world of graphic science, then that thinker assumes a position of radical objectivity. Imaginary supernova becomes conceptually equivalent to the vanishing point in a perspectival composition. The art of images reflects on the possibility of anticipating the future by evaluating the options in further evolution. Signs as patterns of coordinated interpretive activity constituting embodied cognition in the overall dynamics of the Tarot's semiotic system. An interdisciplinary research should give the go-ahead to a philosophical worldview combining the enterprise of experimental metaphysics with criticism at its best. Criticism displaying the rich art of evaluating and analyzing with knowledge and propriety the works of civilization.
All human knowledge up to the highest flights of science is but the development of our inborn animal instincts. Every reasoning has diagrammatic elements, and diagrammatic reasoning is the only fertile reasoning. A diagram, indeed, so far as it has a general signification, is not a pure icon. But in the middle part of our reasonings, we forget that abstractness in great measure, and the diagram is for us the very thing. So in contemplating a painting, there is a moment when we lose the consciousness that it is not the thing. The distinction of the real and the copy disappears, and it is, for the moment, a pure dream. Not any particular existence, and yet not general. At that moment, we are contemplating an icon. The military nature of linguistic communication is intrinsically moral, like protecting the group by obeying shared norms, and at the same time violent, like killing or mobbing to protect the group. This human linguistic behavior is clearly made intelligible when we analogously see it as echoing the anti-predatory behavior which birds, for example, perform through the use of suitable alarm calls and aggressive threats. In the context of the discussion of camouflage, what is abductively inferred are environmental affordances. In an adversarial environment, survival for any animate organism is a matter of coping with the environment, and the relationship with the environment is mediated by a series of cues the organism must make sense of in order to generate, even if tacitly, some knowledge it did not possess before. Thus, detectors and deceivers engage in an effort to produce signs that fall outside of the agent's detection mechanisms, or which cause the adversary to make false inferences, resulting in them acquiring and acting upon beliefs that, while briefly appearing as suitable opportunities for action, will result in a failure of their intended act. This, as we can see, is a clear epistemological description of the inferential dynamics of camouflage, mimicry, feints, and other forms of deception. In the context of ecological predation, Magnani If you subscribe, I will explain Deleuze to you.
Is it any good so far?